Donald. We've known each other. I think it's over, oh, it's too many years now.
So many years.
Everyone, I just want to give you an idea of the format for today. I'll be asking Anna and Fiona a series of questions, and then they're going to have a conversation, which we're really looking forward to. I'll be monitoring the chat. So if I see, for example, 4 or 5 questions that have there's certain trends and patterns, I might just say, Anna and Fiona, I've noticed there's 5 questions that have a similar theme, and then also respond to your questions. Also during the webinar, I'll be putting in links that let you connect with Anna and Fiona with their blog. So maybe your question wasn't responded to, but there's so many ways to be connected with Anna and Fiona. So if your question wasn't responded to, there's another way to contact them. So first of all, thank you, Anna, Fiona. We're going to do a virtual round of applause, everybody. So I know we can't hear you, but at least we can go like this and say thank you. I'm going to start off with the first question, which is really about telling us something about yourselves, how relation to documentation, something about you, a reflection, an antidote, and what is it in your DNA that makes you so passionate about documentation in the early years? So I think we'll start off with Anna.
Thank you, Nancy. Delighted to be here and just in awe of so many people that are willing to give us our time. So very, very grateful. And what an interesting question. Thank you. And you know what, I think, like with everything, your understanding of documentation as a process kind of deepens over time, right? But I think very early in my journey with documentation, there was this really huge aha moment that I thought I'll share with you. And I remember at some point we took a group of 3-year-olds into the museum, the local art museum in Singapore. And there was a group of children who were really, well, many of them actually were really drawn to this very vibrant painting of what they called the monster with the spiky tongue, which was their interpretation of this painting, right? And there was, I think overall really interesting to see how children are so physically drawn to these images and so on. But when we got back to school, one of the things that I proposed to the children was that we would make our own paintings of monsters, which they were interested in. So at some point, some of the children drew monsters on transparencies, and then we projected them onto the wall. And then at some point, we choose one of these drawings that we wanted to draw and then paint, so that we would also have one of our really big paintings in our classroom space. So at some point, I had kind of traced this monster and I put it on the floor. And I remember looking, and then I saw that all the children were really kind of physically exploring this painting with their bodies. And I remember documenting this, right? So I took a photograph, I wrote down what they said, because they started making connections, right? And somebody said, oh, it's like the swimming pool at home. So I'm kind of thinking that they were talking about like a small kind of baby pool, right? So and these are 3-year-olds that are exploring size and making connections. And I documented it, but I have to say, it was on the floor, and I took it from the floor and we put it on the wall. And afterwards, when I was looking at the photographs and so on, I kind of realized that, gosh, I could have left it there for a while. There was a point there. I think the children were telling me something. This was important for them. They had to explore this some more before you put it on the wall, because then it becomes a different thing, isn't it? So I think very early I started to realize that what documentation does, among other things, is that it talks back to you, and it gives you a really deep insight in the kind of thinking that children do and the way they approach things. And I think that that's really how it got into my DNA, so to say. How about you, Fee?
Oh, there's so many different moments in your working life that could be little fragments of your DNA coming together when it comes to being living the life of a documenter. One story I remember is very early on in my career, and I'm sure this probably resonates with many people who are listening in. I can remember being handed in my second, perhaps even my first year of teaching, a clipboard with a really long checklist of can they balance a beanbag on their head, can they walk across a plank, and I was pushing these children through this exercise, ticking them off as either competent or working towards or not yet. And I remember feeling quite sick in my stomach that this was what we were asking children to do, as a record of what they had learned during the day. And that same day, I had been working with that same group of children in a big mud pit that it had been raining in this particular context we're in for many weeks of rain. So we had mud everywhere. And we were bringing our gum boots to school, and we were often up to our knees in mud during the day. So it felt like such a break away from the genuine inquiry that they were having in the mud pit to then stop and say, it's time to assess our gross motor skills now. So I felt really uneasy about that process. And it wasn't until a child came up to me and said, when we've done this thing for you to write down, can we go back to the mud pit? And can you bring the photographs from yesterday so we can work out how we made that big bubble? And I suddenly clicked on and went, aha, I am documenting, I am assessing children's learning, but I'm stopping it to do what somebody else expects me to do. And the somebody else was the greater system. So I learned very quickly then that documentation was another way, and it helped me answer this uneasy question that I constantly felt myself saying at the end of the day, where I was saying there has to be another way. There has to be another way from assessing children this way. But I'm going to fast forward 20 years. The second pivotal moment where I realized that this actually was part of me rather than something I did, when I was standing in Hanoi leading a workshop with 100 teachers in the room, and I had been documenting for many years and experimenting with all sorts of different ways of doing it, sometimes getting it disastrously wrong, sometimes getting it almost right, never quite settling on my own pattern. But what I noticed was I had a question from the audience in this workshop, and somebody had said, hypothetically, what would you do if you took a job in a school and they said, you cannot document here? We don't do that here. What would you do? And I was caught off guard. I had 100 people in front of me, and I thought, now hang on a minute. I just need to sit with this for a second. So I said, okay, I want you to think about what you would do while I think about what I would do. And very quickly it came to the surface in me that if I was in a context where the leadership or the collective pedagogy around me said, we don't document here, you can't do that, I actually couldn't teach. And I had this moment of realization with 100 people around me saying, I don't think I could come to work the next day, not because my values were compromised, not because my belief system was under threat, but because I need documentation in order to relaunch the next morning. And without that, I'm lost at sea trying to work out where to take these children because I have no data to go back to. I have no juicy, meaty conversation or drawing or photograph or video from which to take today's chapter. So I kind of realized I can't teach without it.
But both of you touched on something so dear. I mean, one thing you said, Fiona, I can imagine, we have almost 200 people on the chat. Getting that clipboard and just getting that list of what you should do. So this goes to the next question is, can you both of you discuss how does documentation, and you were touching on it, Fiona, so I'll have you start off, support the planning and teacher research at their schools? Like, how do they get started? So imagine they get that clipboard and they're totally overwhelmed. And we're looking at purpose rather than just having a checklist of what the school thinks, but can you kind of respond to that in terms of that planning and supporting teaching every day?
Absolutely. I think that, the role of documentation is a journey, and it's a journey that I think we should never finish discovering, because there is no one way to do this. There is no one way you'd never come home at night and say, yeah, I've really got it now. You always come home wondering, what could I do differently? How do I understand myself? What will I do differently in my planning process? And if it really all depends on what the definition of planning is for you. If planning is something where you come together on a set time frame, let's say it's a week or it's 2 weeks or it's a month, and you bring your team together and you project your ways forward, and then you live out everything you write on that document for the next week, 2 weeks or a month. If that's what planning is to you, then documentation is probably not going to be awfully helpful for you, because the ideas that come up on that day will be the ideas you follow for the next period of time. However, if you see planning as a moment in time where you track where you've got to and the couple of avenues you may take as you go forward. It's a documentation of our current state of inquiry. Where are we right now? Where have we been in the last few days? And where might we be headed, given that we've just been here? If that's how you see planning, then I think documentation is deeply embedded in what you do. And that's the sort of thing where I say, I actually can't plan and therefore can't teach if I don't have something to review and analyze.
And I love the idea you can't plan and can't teach unless you have that data. And Anna, how would you respond to that question in terms of, how does documentation support teaching and planning?
Yeah, I think it's a poignant question, Nancy. And I think I'd like to sort of backtrack a little bit, because I know that sometimes it helps to think about documentation and pedagogical documentation as almost two things, although I think that there's also an overlap there. So when we think about documenting learning, I think in the early years, many people understand that, we often observe and document children's learning in order to have data about where children are at, right? Like in terms of their understandings and so on. And I think this has been part of the realm of early childhood for a long time. And there's a place for that, I think. It is important that we have data that gives us information about where children are at with their evolving literacy and so on. But I think pedagogical documentation really adds another layer to our work that is just so poignant, because it helps with analyzing what's going on. And like Pete said, it provides that information for you to think, okay, where do I go next? So it's a way, I think, of staying connected to the children's thinking. And then I think when we do that, and when we commit to that, and I love what Pete said, right, living the life of a documenter, I think what happens then is that we move away from this idea of pre-planned activities, and that we plan in order to support the children in figuring out things, right? Like, so, and we stay connected to their thinking. So for example, the other day, we got this really beautiful question actually from somebody who doesn't ask a lot of verbal questions yet. So it was important to acknowledge this moment for her, right? So Halima at some point said, where do birds live? So what we decided to do is to re-offer that to the group of children. And I have to say, now I think, gosh, I know that's pretty obvious, but I was still surprised by the theories that children generated and shared with us, the ideas that they had about where birds live. Because many children thought that birds live in nests, but most children were convinced that they live inside birdhouses. And they created these really beautiful drawings of these birdhouses with tiny tables and chairs and beds and so on. And so now that you get to a point where you think, okay, if I know that this is, where the theories are at, what can we do to support the children with perhaps expanding, deepening, or changing their theories? So one of the things that we did in this case, because we're also in distance learning, this is just the moment that we went back online, is that I actually interviewed my mother as an expert, and she talked about, where birds live. And then we sort of said, okay, so if they don't live in birdhouses, then what are birdhouses for? So we didn't really want to give away the answer, and we thought perhaps, if we approach it this way, we stay connected to this process, we kind of complicate it and deepen it, and let's see what the children do with this, provocations, let's say.
I love something I can feel coming up that might be others are thinking as well. How do you see the relationship with documentation to assessment? Because right now, the question could be, what are we assessing with this documentation? Are we assessing student learning? Are we assessing teacher practice? Are we assessing the learning environment? So how would you respond to that? Start with Fiona.
Well, there's a PhD in this. So,
and we have 45 minutes, so let's do it.
Perhaps one of the side agendas of our chat today is we may discover 2 or 3 PhD topics. This is going to be this notion of the relationship between documentation and assessment has been written about by many people, and it has been written about from many points of view. So I encourage everybody listening to try and work out what you think this is, rather than seek an answer from somewhere else. However, we're both on the line. Let's flesh out what we think, shall we? So I think it's a really sad day. And this is where Anna and I love disagreeing with each other. I'm very happy for us to have a lovely disagreement, because that's a territory of learning, right? I think it's a really sad day when we see documentation's purpose as being assessment. I think that one of the possible functions of documentation is that it can act as a vehicle for assessment. But if we give the identity of assessment to documentation, I think we're robbing it and robbing children of the riches that this strategy brings to their daily engagement with the world and the riches that it brings to our own professional development. I think, the most critical thing you will do in your own professional development journey is listen to your children and your colleagues around you and constantly dig underneath what you're seeing to try and engage some metacognition, some critical reflection, to try and understand our role as educators. The interactive space of pedagogy, it isn't a space of transmission. It isn't a space of receiving skills, knowledge, and understanding. It's a space of co-generation. And documentation is like the little lamp that gives visibility to that co-generation of learning. And I think that, if I was to use an analogy, some documentation practices, and everyone settles on their own way. It's really important that we all know it's okay to settle on your own way. But some documentation practices that I sometimes struggle with, if I use an analogy, is like looking in the rear view mirror of the car. It's always looking about where we've been. It's looking about what we did yesterday, what the children did, what they said. And it doesn't put those two views together, where we've been and where we are looking at going. What is the view ahead of us? What does the terrain ahead of us hold, given that we've had this journey to get here? So I really like this parallel view of looking at our immediate past, looking at what's happened, and then sitting in the now and looking ahead of us and saying, right, given that we've done this, we've said this, we've been here, where will that take us? Which roads ahead could we travel together? And which roads will be the most fruitful? Because we don't choose all the roads that lead forward from where we are. And then how do we make those choices? So I think if I come back to your question about the relationship with documentation and assessment, when I'm sitting in the now, I can extract data that acts as assessment data. But if that's all that I document, then I've missed the magic of learning. All I've done is hold myself accountable to a set of skills, knowledges, dispositions that somebody says, or we say as a school, is what we need to be doing. I think assessment is, and I'm still wrestling with this, I think it's a really fabulous byproduct of rich documentation practices, but I don't see them as the same thing. What do you think?
Fiona, I was just saying, what do you think? I mean, I love what you just thought about the rear view mirror. What a beautiful analogy, looking at the past. That was really well articulated. Anna.
Yeah, I was just thinking the same, Nancy. I love that analogy. I love that. And I can't agree more with you, Fee. I love this notion of the documentation helping us to look about what might happen next, right? And that we do some projection in terms of things that we can help children figure things out. I also think that documentation is a really interesting place because it brings us in a space of uncertainty where we really wrestle with complexity, with context. And it kind of helps us to kind of challenge this idea of best practice and that something works everywhere, right? And I really love that about documentation. But going back to your question, Nancy, I do think that it really depends on how we position assessment. What comes to our mind when we talk about assessment. And I think often when we think about assessment, we think about measuring learning. But if we broaden this notion of assessment and we start thinking about it in ways that we monitor learning, ways that we document learning, ways that we measure learning, and ways that we report out on learning. And I know that this is heavily influenced by the stance that the PYP has on assessment, but I think when we broaden this notion of what we think about assessment, that we also think about assessment as feedback and so on, then I think documentation fits within this, right? But pedagogical documentation particularly has a richness that I think almost lives on its own, right? Because it changes us as educators because we start digging so much deeper into not only the way children learn and the way they think and the way we can support them with learning and discovering things independently and together as a learning group. But I think it also helps us to deeply think about our own lenses, our own ways of being, and that's something that and documenting where a child is at with their literacy skills, that doesn't do that. But I also know that that's also a reality in many schools, right? We often work in either local schools or international schools or with a certain curriculum where this is asked of us. So this is, I think, a reality that many educators are grappling with, that I'm not grappling with. This is also something that is asked of me. So I think it is also about finding a way to do this and to do that that deeper thinking that is so much richer. Like it's kind of navigating that complexity, I think.
Both you, Anna, there's something you said there that I think is really worth us unpacking, and that is the difference between documentation and pedagogical documentation. And I'm going to borrow from the thinking of Professor Alma Fleet, an Australian professor, retired now, an amazing thinker in the space of early childhood. And she suggests that there is a difference, where you sit with it is up to you, but she suggests that she feels there is a difference between documentation and other forms of record keeping. It's really important that that extra piece is attached there, and pedagogical documentation. And the difference, according to Alma, is the space of interpretation, the space of dialogue with your colleagues around something that you've captured, to share the wondering, to bring yourselves to the uncertainty. We don't know what this means. Let's see if we can unpack this together. And then we might distill that down to some new understandings about children, about childhood, about learning, about assessment, about ourselves, about pedagogy. But it's this space of interpretation that makes it pedagogical. And I think those words are such wise words.
When I hear about the difference between the two, I was just going to say your difference between the two keeps on putting the word purpose into my mind. Like, what is the purpose of what you're trying to achieve with this type of documentation? Anna, what were you just going to say?
No, like I was just going to say that, like to me too, I think that that's really the essence of it. Like that notion of the interpretation and the depth of co-constructing meaning around it, that makes a difference from record keeping.
I'm going to ask a question a little bit off the side. When you work with schools, have you had to help them differentiate between pedagogical documentation and just documentation to help them define it? And how do you help them define it between the two? So this is such an important aspect that you're talking about, pedagogical documentation and documentation. So how do you help schools define and differentiate between the two?
I might jump in there with some ideas just that come to my mind at the moment. I think one of the most valuable things you can do when you're working with a school, and it's such a privilege to come to a school for a day, a couple of days, or a week, and be, deeply connected to their life for such a short but intense period of time. I think one of the greatest things we can do is sit around a table with our documentation in front of us. I mean, it's great to do workshops, it's great to do presentations, but the most value a team gets is when you help them with their context, with their work. And so it's about having the courage to say, let's make a time frame. A couple of hours is usually enough to get that juices going. Bring your documentation, and then I'm just going to ask you questions about it. And it's the act of modeling the interpretive space that helps them to, for themselves, see the distance between one and the other. It's really about putting the systems in place, the time to dialogue, that helps you to move from the record keeping to the pedagogical documentation. It's like learning to drive a car. I know I'm using car analogies today. Where they're coming from, but they're coming. Notion of you could be handed the highway code and read the rule book and handed the manual for how to drive the car, and someone could show you this is what the indicator does and this is how the wheel works, and if you really want I can teach you about the differential. Personally I don't need to know that, but some do. Some like to know that. And that's not going to help me to learn to drive, is it? I've got to get behind the wheel and I've got to have a coach beside me. And documentation is the same. You have to get behind the wheel and have a coach beside you. And there's nothing more powerful than taking real evidence, real videos, not hypothetical pieces, but your pieces that you took today they're glorious, rough, raw pieces of documentation, they're data, and then saying, well, there's 3 things we could do with this. We could go this way, we could make a video, or we could sit down and work out the 5 great questions that jump off the page after we've seen this. And which question will we take back to the children tomorrow? So I think it's an act that has to be lived.
Yeah, it makes me think of something I once heard Tiziana Filipina say, like, and then there, like there's that, she smiles and there's such wisdom somehow in her body language when she also says, there's not something that someone can really teach you. It's almost like you have to teach yourself, because it really is your own process too, I think. But I have to say, Nancy, I think often when I work with schools, I think it's important at some point to make explicit that we sometimes, words have such power, don't they? Think about words as play, or a word as provocation, or documentation. We all bring meanings to it. So often in workshops, I kind of make that explicit. And we spend some time unpacking what we mean when we use those words. And then it turns out often that we seem to have very different ideas about what invitations are, what provocations are, and what play means to us. What's the difference between guided play and structured play, or whatever it is. And so the same, I think, applies to documentation. We also need some time to unpack what we mean by that, and to look at what other people say when they talk about documentation. I guess there's some really clever people that have been writing about documentation for quite some time. So I think that helps as well, kind of to dip into some resources and some really clever people that can help us expand our own ideas about what documentation is and why it is so important. And then, yes, you have to start doing it. There's no other way about it. You have to learn it. So
I'd love to add to that, Anna, that we can, once we get really involved in this process of interpreting together and unpacking and really teasing out the possibilities that might launch from the page when you've got this page of rough notes, we can also forget that this is a really valuable learning tool for children. And I don't know how many teams who are that well practiced with their documentation take it then back to the children, but it's often the most humbling of moments when you do. I remember not so long ago, maybe about a year ago, I was working with a school and we had taken some raw data and we had this really clever thing that children had said. And we came and we interpreted it, we launched forward with our questions, and we had this great big mind map from one couple of little series of images and a couple of comments. And we took it back to the children after we'd spent 2 hours digging into it, and they said, that's not what we meant. And we went, oh, okay. Well, what did you mean? And they said, no, we don't want to do that. We were thinking we would go outside and we would do this outside to see if it was the same inside. And when we went back to what they had said, it was there, and we glossed over it. And so I think there's this space where we all have to really be very human about this, and enjoy the fact that children are in the process with us. It's not something we do to children. It's something we do alongside and with children. So it's such a beautiful thing to take back to children. It's such a humbling thing when they say, oh, you're so wrong. I mean, there's nothing better than a voice of a child redirecting you to where probably it needed to go.
Anna, you
and
look
now,
like
and now looking into the ethics of documentation, don't we, and everything, with the ethics, which is another really complex thing, another PhD subject, probably, Fee. Because I think it is important to check in with children and say, okay, this is what I think about your thinking, but what is it that you think about your thinking, right? But talking about ethics, I think it's also important to sometimes implicit, sometimes explicit, ask permission from children to publish some of the photographs, like to publish their words, their thinking, to make a video, to take a photograph. I think that's important, I think.
Your 2 comments just now confirmed why you're so well respected, because I love the idea that many presenters, when they go to a school, they have the same PowerPoint that they've used in 7 different schools without looking at the context of, number one, their student population and their teacher population. So just sitting down when you mention that really reflects who you are as educators. And believe it or not, because we're talking about working with students, we have so many comments in the chat now about strategies. So for example, we had one person ask, do you use any specific strategies for documenting learning in younger learners? Is it a mix? Is it pictures? Is it audio? Records, handwriting? That was one question about strategies. Another one was just looking at resources that you would recommend. So you just hit a certain nerve with, we have the 200 people here, is about strategies, which is the best way to work with younger learners.
Yeah, I think the strategies question is it's really important. It's what we grapple with when we're starting to get deeper into this journey, but it's also highly contextual and it's highly personalized. In the same teaching team, I might have somebody who really is uncomfortable with the digital world and would still like to write on a piece of paper in their own shorthand, in their own way. And for them, they can find their moment of flow much quicker if they have a pen and paper in their hand. And yet somebody else might be really handy with the video, can flick it over, can edit that quickly to bring it back to a planning meeting. And so those two educators that might be working as a team each feed the documentation with the strategies that they bring to that. So I'm a little bit nervous to say, these are the things here's your top 10 tips for strategies. I think what you have to do is be brave enough to try lots and lots of different ways and work out what is your language for documentation, what is your strategy. And the big question for me is, how quickly can you find flow as a documenter? And if you're getting into the flow of the moment and the strategies aren't holding you back, then you keep going in that direction without being so myopic about it that you don't try a new thing when it comes along. I remember when voice to text was a new thing, and I was suddenly thinking, wow, this is going to blow our minds. We are going to voice to text everything. And I took this great big screed of conversation between children, and then we couldn't really work out who said what when we saw all the comments, and they were cutting across each other as children do so beautifully, cross-pollinating in the moment. And I got a whole page of gobbledygook out of that voice to text. So I don't know, Anna, what do you think?
Yeah, look, I'm just kind of thinking about my own practices, and I think it's a little bit of everything. Hey, like as you become more comfortable and more attuned into it, perhaps. But I think notating is one thing that always works. At least for me, like those quick notes, photographs, video. Like I think video captures something else. Hey, did you get the movements, you get the sounds, and so on. And the great thing about video, I think, is that you can look back at it. But then, of course, there's the challenge of the length of the video, because if it's 10 minutes, it's 10 minutes of your time, and so on. So it all depends, right? I also really love this idea of drawings and paintings and other languages that children have access to. Because I think if you keep those artifacts over time, it also tells a story, doesn't it? So I'd say there is no one way, and it's often a collection of all these different things that you do that add to that richness of that experience. So like I often record the conversations that I have with children, particularly when we're together as a learning group, because I find it easier just to use my voice recorder and look at children and support that conversation. And then it makes it easier to analyze it afterwards. But I don't use a lot of voice recording while children are playing. So I kind of dip in and out of these different strategies, I think, and that works well for me. And I think, like you said, you have to kind of find your own voice within it, of something that works for you.
Anna, your comment, we have a question. How often should we participate in the child's learning or interrupt it as opposed to standing back and documenting?
Yeah, I think the word interrupt is interesting. Hey, like, because I think we have to think very carefully about how we enter a context where a child or children are learning and interacting with materials or whatever it is, that's happening in a child's play. So I think perhaps it's never interrupting. It's thinking about a way that we enter that space with the child, and we can do that in different ways, right? And this is a really, really complex thing. I know in Reggio they talk about I think a 15-year apprenticeship or something, and I think it's a metaphor. They're trying to tell us that this is really complex and something that we keep on learning. Because every moment is unique, every child's unique, every context is unique. So we need to think about this very carefully. And it kind of takes me to a moment just a while ago in my classroom where a child was putting a hijab on her head. And this is really important for her. She was talking about her own sense of identity when she said, I want to be a Muslim. So she was putting this on her head, and then her friend, who was also said to me at that point, she's like, well, it's good that you ask us, because we know a lot about what it means to be a Muslim, which I also thought was very moving. But her friend looked at her and said, no, that's not right. And before I knew it, I stepped into that space and said, no, it's okay. If she wants to do that, it's okay. And afterwards, I really had to reflect on that, because perhaps, with my intervention, I prevented this one child from actually explaining why she felt it wasn't okay, right? And I think this is important, that we keep on thinking about, what makes us behave a certain way. And this is hard, right? Because there's no one certain way of doing this. I can't give you one piece of advice, but I'd say be reflective and thoughtful and think back of those moments. And was this supportive in the child's learning? Was this needed? Was this a way that you could expand and support the child with his or her learning, or perhaps they could have done it on their own? What do you think, Fee? This is hard.
Well, it raises so many thoughts, doesn't it? There's such a beautiful story about that child and her own sense of identity, her sense of engagement with others over her culture, not just this is me and this is what I am, but I'm explaining to you why this is important to me, because this connects us. It's the invisible kind of connection realm that we have. But I really struggle with some of the stuff that I see in online and in social media about, I think it's an assumption that people are making when they say, we do too much documentation, it takes us away from the children. And when we document, we really shouldn't we be spending that time with the children instead of writing down what they do. And I really struggle with this because, look, I'm holding a pen right now. I'm scribbling notes on the side based on our conversations. And I'm doing that because I can't think without tracking some of the big concepts that are emerging in our conversation. And because I'm scribbling notes and concepts that are arising in our conversation, I'm coming closer to the conversation and I'm not interrupting. That word interrupt is because we often interrupt because there's an idea that pops into our head and we're frightened if we don't say it now, we'll lose it. If I write it down, I can decide in a few minutes if it's worth coming back to. But it gives me a moment of pause. And it helps me to actively listen to what's happening. Listen with my eyes, listen with my ears, listen with all my senses to what's happening and watch the conversation unfold rather than project where I think it will go. So this is coming back to that I can't teach if I don't document, because all I would be doing is interrupting children with this space of what's in my head. Documentation is the act of parking these things that we see to decide later on, are they worthy of further exploration? Can we open them up and find many ways forward? Look at it, I really struggle with this notion of documentation taking you away from children. I think it brings you much, much closer. It puts you inside the relationship between children and their learning.
I think it also you get a better understanding of who your students and how they learn. Anna, you're shaking your head. Please add.
And I'm thinking that like if you've got that sensitivity and this real awareness of what's going on and the moments that you may support it or not, and sometimes you really need it. Hey, I'm kind of thinking of a moment again just last week where we had this huge conflict and there were tears and they were both upset and they couldn't work it out. I'm like, and this is a moment where you join, and then that's, you're not making the notes while you're there. And you're thinking about a way that you can support these children through these conflicts. But then afterwards, you may jot down some of the things that happened there that give you, again, valuable insight in where particular children are coming from. So in this case, this was one child who said, well, it was my idea, so now we have to play the way I want to play because it was my idea. And I think that this is valuable information to write down afterwards, because it says something about the child. Like, so I think it's also that kind of awareness of sometimes afterwards, jotting down some of the things that happened, because it tells you something about where the child's at and perhaps ways that we can support this child. We're thinking about empathy and perspective taking and the complexity of play.
And
so
no, please.
It becomes, I think, disposition. It becomes a disposition, it's second nature. Like I honestly couldn't teach without a pen and a pencil and a camera and so on. It's just a way. It's not just. It is a way of being. It is a way of working alongside children. And of course, we understand that sometimes, we're in the moment with children without this pencil or this camera. But I don't feel like I'm away from children the moment I take a photograph. I feel deeply connected with them, I think, as I'm documenting.
Do you think, Anna, that it's because it makes you more curious? Do you think when you take that picture, you're taking it because you're curious to know what's happening here rather than you want to record it for a piece of evidence?
Yeah, I know in radio they talk about this idea of listening, right? Which is just so beautiful. So I think it is also about perhaps the curiosity of what you're able to notice and what moves me, and the amazing capacities that children have to learn and construct meaning, to figure things out together. So it always brings me in this place of awe, but also a place of curiosity, because there's always something unexpected, right? Something that you didn't foresee, a different way of doing things, a different theory, a different way of interacting, a different way of figuring out. And children are just so incredibly capable at making these unexpected connections, don't they, between concepts and ideas, and then all of a sudden you get these real inventive new ways of doing things that I just love, and brings me that deep joy, I think. So I think that's what it does for me. How about you?
In Reggio, they talk about the extraordinary and the ordinary, and I love the way that the moments that you capture make visible things that are right there in front of you that you would not see. And I'll share with you a small story that happened in my own context. So the role I have is from babies all the way up to year 2 as a deputy head of campus. And so I get the joy of sitting with really little ones and watching them grow all the way through the school. And I was in the baby's room not many weeks, only a couple of weeks ago, and watching a new baby who was orienting into the room, who was spending some time just becoming comfortable with the room with his mother present, and mum would stay and they would only be there for an hour. And so the educator was talking to the mother, and I thought, I'm just going to go and see what happens. And he's not yet crawling, he's just sitting. He's maybe 6 or 7 months old. He's sitting on a mat with some beautiful provocation material, exciting things to pick up, and everyday objects. But everyday objects are so exciting to everybody who takes time to notice, especially babies. And one little baby who was maybe a couple of months older, not yet crawling either, was sitting beside this little boy, and he picked up a pastry brush which was inside a basket of everyday objects, and he brushed this little boy's feet. He had bare feet, and he brushed it gently across his toe. And it was an act of encounter. It was an act of relationship building. And this beautiful moment happened where the new child looked up at the other child and just smiled. You're tickling my toe. And I watched as Mum was talking to the educator. Nobody really saw this moment. We were all busy doing other things, and I just watched to see what would happen. And it was maybe 2 or 3 minutes had passed as they were just sitting, exploring the space around them. And the new child then picked up a funnel and handed it to the other child. So there was this reciprocal act of, you've tickled my toe, here's something for you. And I thought, this child's just coming to know our context, doesn't know the other people in the space. This is a very unfamiliar context. And yet the documentation, had we have taken it in that moment, would have been such a powerful statement of how children are always ready to enter into relationship with the world around them and the other people around them. And those are the moments where you think, oh, I should have captured that. Yeah. So there is documenter's guilt that sits inside us all. But it was just such a small moment in time that helped me remember it's making the invisible visible. And that's part of what we should be doing when we're working with children.
Love that. Making the visit. Your comments have actually ignited a bit about many schools have been online for months. And, they're looking at, you just said, making the learning, making the invisible visible. Online has created so many silver linings, because I do think there's silver linings in what's happened with COVID, but there's been some challenges. And we've had at least 3 or 4 questions about, what is the suggested strategies when working with early learners when being online? Acknowledging the realities that they're working with 3, 4, 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, and getting that documentation. So, whoever would like to start first.
I
know that there's many people that work with.
Go ahead,
Anna. Shall I go first?
Go ahead.
I know that there's people.
I should have said someone's name. We're just such in a flow right now. I was like, oh my goodness, I'm loving this. Anna, you go for it.
And I know that there's many schools that work with an online portfolio, which is a nice place, I think, to collaborate with families and upload photographs and things that children have created at home, right? But you do need support of parents with this. And I think one of the things that work really well in our context is that we often, we didn't have access to a platform like Zoom or anything else to really meet with the children every day. I don't think that was possible in our context for many reasons. But I think what we did do is that we created a lot of videos where we connected with the children and we called them and so on. So you continue to reach out to children and maintain that relationship. But one of the things that we did was that we used the photographs as things that they had created, things that they had said, or things that we had asked them to think about. And then we would share that with the community so that they were still connected to each other's thinking. And that worked really, really well. So the children were still aware that, when you put out that question about the birds, let's go back to the birds, and this idea that, if they don't live inside a birdhouse, then what's the birdhouse for? And the children were still invited to draw about that, and that we could show those drawings through the videos that we created, that they still felt connected with each other. And that there was still a place for documentation in that sense, because it helped us to share and highlight each other's thinking.
And Fiona?
So one of the things that we've had a relatively short period of online learning compared to many places around the world, but one of the things we learned really quickly with our young students, our kindergarten 4 and 5-year-old students, was that the risk of learning online is, sorry, it's very windy here. If you can hear the noise, I apologize. The risk of learning online is that it becomes too individualized between the teacher and the family, and the teacher and the family, and the teacher and the family, as they become conduits to share this space of learning. So just as Anna has said, it's about connecting the children together. We realised very quickly that an individual portfolio, an ebook, we have electronic books that we make with Book Creator, and an individual one was not going to be the best glue to hold the community together. So we quickly flipped that with our kindergarten classes to community books. And so no longer did each child had their own individual portfolio, but they also had these community books. And the community books were along a particular research thread or an inquiry thread. So all children could add to that book from home. And then we watched it as it bounced between children as they proposed stories and commented on each other's photographs. And some of those were then recorded in individual portfolio books, but it was very much giving them a facility where they could bring their voices together. So it was just a simple flick across to let's make a new book to talk about the sticks you find in your back garden and what that means and how you use them and what role sticks could play in our learning. And all of a sudden it took off. And we had one community book about dinners you'd been cooking and food that was culturally valuable to you. We had one book about the secret treasures you could find in your garden. It just carries its own life when you open the platform to the collaborative act of learning rather than the individualized act of learning.
There was a question about to what degree.
I even saw something online. Fiona, I just wanted to say I saw something online that I thought was really moving. So this was a community school, right, where they had this park kind of in the middle of the community that everybody had access to, and the children actually during online learning brought something to a tree and kind of left it there, and then other children would go there and find these really tangible pieces there in that space, which I thought was really beautiful. So I know some schools that have done similar things where children could bring some of their projects to school and then at some point even sort of walk through that space to reconnect with some of the things that other children had created, but then not while there were many people in the space. It was perhaps just the child with their family. So there are things, creative ways to sort of go around this, hey, and to still bring children together as a learning group.
There's quite a bit of questions now about first use data or documentation.
Sorry, Nancy, we can't hear you. We can't.
Oh, that's odd. How about now? No?
Yeah, a little better. Yeah.
That's a shame.
That's better.
Somebody must be getting tired. My computer's like, Nancy, what are you doing? Can you hear me now? Are you guys okay? Yes? Okay, I'm not freezing. Sometimes people fake freeze. They go, we're not really frozen. There was questions about how much do you share with parents in terms of this documentation? Do you share everything that you've documented? Or when do you start making that decision that this is what I will share with the families and this is what I use in terms of my own reflection to get a better understanding of the learner? Fiona, you want to start off?
Yeah, I think if you see documentation as something you collect in order to share with families, then you will probably overshare. If you document in the way that we document in order to teach, you'll probably overshare a lot of information with families. And I think that, sometimes you cannot see much of the learning journeys that are taking place if you keep sharing everything all the time. For me, it is actually about the decision-making process we go through, again, collaborative decision-making process, so not ever on your own, to say, what's most important here? And one thing that I often bring to teams, it's not my own questions, they're the 4 questions from Daniel Pink, and you can certainly look these up online, where when he's trying to get to the kind of the hub of the matter, he will ask these 4 questions. What's the big idea? Why does it matter? Why should we care? And what should we do? And so I adapt those often in many different ways with teams to say, let's create a bit of a scaffold of questions that we can throw into the middle of our conversation when we're analysing our documentation to say which pieces of these will bubble to the surface as things that we will share with parents and why. It has to come back to purpose. If you're sharing because you need to share, if you're sharing because you have 4 focus children this week and they are going to have something shared, then I would argue that your purpose is a checklist. And your purpose is probably watching a calendar to make sure that equity has been reached over time. But if your purpose is to show the twists and turns of key learning moments for all children across time, then you're going to need to enter into some discussion about which are the key moments that you need to share with parents. And the benefit of that is that then you create a space of intrigue for parents. I would never, sharing with parents is never a one-way process. It's always a way to engage the parent with the program. So that the space of sharing with parents should be bringing families back into the place of understanding our children together.
Anna?
Yeah, so it is about those key learning moments for individual children, but also for the group. And I think often when I think about the decisions that I make about the documentation that I share with parents, it's also about the way the group constructs meaning and the complexity of that and how this evolves. So it's often about the conversations that we have, the big questions that come up, perhaps a proposal from a child that takes us into a new direction. So it's fluid, it's unexpected, but I think what it does is it shows the incredible competency of children when it comes to learning. And I think it also acknowledges the fact that learning isn't linear. And to me, that is a really key idea that is important also to make visible to parents. Because I think we often come from this idea that learning can be sort of put into boxes and it's linear and we do this and then we do that. But learning isn't like that, isn't it? If you just think about my own learning, it goes in all kinds of directions and you have to backtrack and then it goes into another space. But this is the reality of learning and that's the richness of it, I think. So to me, it's also about this idea of the competent child and the complexity and the non-linearity of learning that I would like to make visible to parents.
Nice. Would you believe we only have 3 minutes left? We've already been speaking. Yes, the time has absolutely flown by. I mean, everybody, you've been asking so many questions, and we have put Fiona and Anna's Twitter handle in the chat because you might want to contact them directly. I think for the last 3 minutes, so we talked about this. I'm going to go from this conversation today, between listening to you both, what would be one comment that you both agree to that you would want to reiterate to what we can do today? So Anna, something that Fiona said that you would say, yes, I totally agree with it. And then Fiona, you would do the same with Anna to say, yes, I really agree with Anna said, this really resonated with me. So I'm going to give you a minute to reflect while people are sending really nice and everyone, we're actually working on a protocol, the 4A's, which is agree, argue, aspire, and assume, but we don't have enough to do all four. So we're just going to do the agree. So you can take away something that's positive, that really resonated with our presenters today before we go. And I just can't believe how quickly 58 minutes have passed by, and your engagement in the chat has been absolutely overwhelming. I know that Shauna will have this recorded to post. And it looks like our lovely panelists are ready to begin of something that they agreed with from the other and would like to say how it resonated with them. So I'm going to start with Anna. If you would start first, please.
Thank you, Nancy. Well, I loved how Fee kind of reframed when I was talking. Remember that she asked me that question about like that notion of curiosity, and I was talking about what documentation does to me, and that she reframed it as making the ordinary extraordinary, and like that richness of those moments. And I think I thought that was just a beautiful way of looking at that, right? And this idea of the encounter and the act of the encounter and the relationships that children develop every day. And it kind of throws another light on documentation, I think, that will help me to push my documentation forward. And searching for those moments, right? Where ordinary moments that are actually extraordinary, that are just so special. So thanks for that, Fee.
Look, that's lovely that that's helped you to think in new directions, because I know that every time we have a conversation, we both walk away changed, and we both walk away going, "Ooh, I need to go think about that." So there's lots of juicy moments for me to think about. Anna, there's many moments I could have picked, but I think that last point that you shared about non-linearity is just something that I do not pay enough attention to. I know it's so true. I'm always saying we're teaching children, not robots. It doesn't work on a production line. But how the question, I think I'm going to take your agree, your A, Nancy, and of course I don't stick to a recipe. I'm a non-linear learner. So I'm going to change the agree. I'm going to launch from the agree into action and say, there's my A that I'm going to settle on. And I'm walking away now thinking, how am I making visible the non-linear ways that learning happens? And how can I deliberately trouble and encounter this space so that I can show this complex, rich, messy process in a clear way, but not a prescriptive way. So I'm leaving thinking about all the lovely non-linear moments that we share.
Now I'm going to ask everybody. We have 198 people on right now. And before doing anything, just don't put in the chat yet. But Fiona just left with a really powerful word, is action. It's really great to do a webinar, but if you're not going to do something afterwards, an actionable, you have to think, what am I going to take away from this? So right now, could everyone think about an actionable that you're going to do when the next time you're in the classroom? Don't put in the chat yet. Just think, reflect. What is that action? I'll give one more minute. And then on the count of 3, I want everyone to put in the chat at the same time. The reason why we do it on the count of 3 is then suddenly we get a list of 198 actionables at once. So everyone start typing, but don't put in the chat yet. Okay, I can see by your faces. Guess what? I can't see your faces. I just say that. So you have your actions ready. That means you promise you're going to try to do this when you are with your students again. 1, 2, 3. Everyone put it in the chat and we should see a stream of actionables. Let's see if it happens. Okay, here they come. Amazing. Oh, they're thanking you, everybody. Okay, we're getting, everyone's being too kind. They're saying thank you, thank you, thank you. Actionables, people. Listen to the ladies all day. They're just loving you. They're just thanking you.
Keep scrolling down, then you'll find.
Here it goes.
Yeah.
Oh, wow, these are great. So I know documentation isn't something we do to children. Wonderful that we do with children. These are powerful actionables. Now you have to promise yourself you're going to do it. So Shauna, I'm actually going to have you do closure, please.
Thank you. I just want to say, it's as Nancy said, I don't even know when those little over an hour just passed by. It's always a pleasure being with you and Anna and Fiona. And whenever I've been with you and your conversations, just there's so much to learn with just even your regular conversation. So thank you so much. In the chat, and everybody is just going wild. I have to say that. Thank you, Nancy. Could not, never, I cannot do this without you. Believe me, this is something I have to say. There is just no way we can do this without you. And thank you all for being here. I know Saturday morning, Saturday evening, middle of the night. So thank you. And I just want to say, this is the first of the complimentary webinar series that we're putting together. We're going to have it through April and May, so please look out for more. And I just want to say thank you for your support. It's been this whole year, right from the beginning to now, workshops in between. Thank you. I don't think I would have survived without you guys. You all have been so kind to me. So thank you so much. And please stay safe. And hopefully I see you guys in person sometime in 2022, not 21 for sure. Thank you again. Bye-bye. Bye. Take care.
Brilliant. Well done. Yay. Stars.
I know. We can clap. Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody. Have a good one.
Yeah.
Donald, save this chat. These could be great quotes.
Yeah, I will. Once we finish before we go. Yeah.
You guys are brilliant. You worked so well together. It was seamless.
Yeah, like I said, when we were planning this, I said the two of them have such good chemistry. Just I've been with them, having a cup of tea, and I'm just listening to them. In Hong Kong, it was such a pleasure having them together. Just listening to them is so good.
Your knowledge.
There's moments where I kind of forget that there's so many people listening. Right? Like I feel like I'm chatting
we're having dinner with noodles and hot pot.
Yes, at the bank in Hong Kong. What a place.
Well, thank you